Hey everyone! Tonight, we're descending into the cold, damp, and deeply unpleasant world of medieval dungeons, where the air stinks of mold, the walls sweat misery, and the rats have seniority. It's dark, it's loud, it's definitely not on any travel brochure. Think you'd last a day? You wouldn't. If that sounds oddly relaxing, hit like and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy this kind of suffering. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, and let's descend together. Imagine waking up in total darkness. Not the kind where your eyes need time to adjust, but the kind where your brain wonders if your eyeballs have actually been removed. Welcome to your new home, a medieval dungeon. Congratulations, you've either committed a crime, annoyed someone powerful, or simply existed in a time when guilt was more of a vibe than a fact. The guards weren't picky. One wrong word, one unpaid tax, or one envious neighbor with a convincing tone, and boom! You're in a hole in the ground. Literally. The year is 1293. You're somewhere beneath a castle in France, or England, or maybe Germany. It doesn't matter, really. The decor is exactly the same. Stone walls, iron chains, rats with excellent survival instincts, and a smell that can only be described as fermented doom. If you've ever wondered what despair smells like, now you know. It's a mix of mildew, rotting flesh, urine-soaked straw, and hope dying slowly in the corner. Now, take a deep breath. Not too deep. You just inhaled a lungful of centuries-old excrement mist. You're lying on a bed of straw, generously sprinkled with the leftovers of the previous occupant, or perhaps 2 or 3 previous occupants. You try not to think about it. There's a draft somewhere, which would be refreshing if it weren't also carrying the scent of damp mold straight up your nostrils. The walls are wet to the touch, not because someone thoughtfully cleaned them, but because they're weeping. That's what stone does after decades of soaking in water and sorrow. A historical curiosity. Medieval dungeon floors were often just compacted dirt, which absorbed every bodily fluid known to man. If you were very lucky, you got straw. If you were very unlucky, you got the straw after it had been used for something else, like draining wounds. Your stomach growls. Unfortunately, the local menu isn't exactly Michelin-starred. Prisoners were fed according to their crime, their wealth, or the mood of the jailer. For most, meals consisted of stale bread so hard it could double as a weapon. Not that you'll ever be trusted with it. Thin soup that was basically warm pond water. And, occasionally, if someone in the kitchen dropped it, a lump of boiled cabbage. Eating wasn't nourishment. It was an endurance challenge. And drinks? Forget about ale. You'll be lucky to get water that hasn't been filtered through the floor above. It's technically liquid, but it glows faintly and moves on its own. Medieval jailers called it swill. You'll call it Tuesday. Oh, and rats. So many rats. They're your new roommates. Unlike you, they're thriving. Fat, fearless, and confident. They treat your limbs as highways and your ears as snack bowls. You swat at them once, and one stares at you with the cool, unblinking gaze of something that's eaten better people than you. He's the alpha. You will not win. Now, you may be thinking, surely someone comes to check on me? Good question. Yes, someone does, eventually. A jailer. He's not there for your well-being. He's there to make sure you haven't escaped through the solid 6-foot-thick stone wall using sheer optimism. If you're lucky, he grunts. If you're unlucky, he talks. Still breathing? He asks with a grin that reveals approximately 3 teeth and at least 6 different diseases. He throws a bucket into the cell. It splashes. You pray it's water. It is not. You ask how long you'll be here. He doesn't answer. That's because, in medieval justice, sentences weren't always measured in time. They were measured in until someone remembers you exist. Could be a week, could be never. Some prisoners were tossed in and forgotten entirely. Their bones discovered decades later when renovations unearthed their cheerful little skeleton in the corner, still chained to the wall. Speaking of chains, yours are iron, rusted, and designed for maximum psychological effect. They're not too tight. That would be merciful. Instead, they're just snug enough to ensure you can't lie down fully or sit up straight. Just enough discomfort to remind you that freedom is a thing that happens to other people. And don't think you'll get rest. Sleep in a medieval dungeon isn't sleep. It's a series of micro-naps interrupted by howling prisoners, scurrying vermin, and the occasional drip of water hitting your forehead like a slow torture technique. There's also the chanting. From the cell down the corridor. Nobody knows who it is. Some say it's a monk gone mad. Others say he's praying for everyone's soul. Mostly, it just adds a lovely soundtrack of existential dread. But the worst part isn't the smell, or the rats, or the hunger. It's the time. Because there's nothing to mark it. No sun, no clock. Just an endless, echoing loop of darkness and damp stone, where minutes blur into hours and days melt into one continuous, stinking, sleepless eternity. Eventually, you'll lose track. You'll stop asking questions. You'll talk to the rats. They won't answer, but you'll appreciate the company. And if you think this is as bad as it gets, well, my friend, you haven't met the torture chamber. But we'll get there soon enough. For now, lie back, or try to, and enjoy your stay in the most authentically horrible Airbnb imaginable. The good news? You probably won't die today. The bad news? You might wish you had. You're awakened by the sound of iron on iron. A key grinding against a lock that hasn't seen oil since the Crusades. It's a deeply unpleasant sound, like a skeleton screaming. And it means one thing. The jailer is back. You didn't expect to feel emotions about a man who smells like turnips and cruelty. But here we are. He's your only contact with the outside world, and that's saying a lot, because he just tossed a rat carcass at your feet and called it provisions. You haven't eaten in what you estimate to be 3 days, or possibly 12. Time, as we established, no longer means anything down here. There is only before rat and after rat. And here comes the real fun. You're being summoned. That's what the jailer says. Summoned. Not released, not pardoned. Summoned. Which in medieval dungeon speak usually means one of 3 things. 1. You're going to trial. 2. You're going to be interrogated. 3. You're going to be tortured. Spoiler, it's number 3. Now don't panic. The good news is that medieval torture wasn't always fatal. Sometimes it was merely character building. The bad news is everything else. You're dragged, and yes, literally dragged, because your legs have the consistency of boiled leeks, down a narrow passageway lit by torches. The walls drip with condensation and the vague suggestion of ancient screams. You pass other cells, most of them occupied by fellow unfortunates. Some are whispering prayers. Others are just rocking back and forth, humming something that sounds suspiciously like London Bridge, except it hasn't been built yet, which makes it extra unsettling. The torture chamber itself is everything you'd hope it wouldn't be. Vaulted stone ceiling, flickering torchlight, and an assortment of tools that could all be generously labeled as misused gardening equipment. There's a rack, a brazier full of glowing coals, some tongs, and something that looks suspiciously like a dentist's chair, if your dentist were Satan and took payments in screaming. A charming gentleman greets you. He's wearing a leather apron and a smile that suggests he genuinely enjoys his work. He refers to himself as the Examiner. You resist the urge to ask for his credentials. "Just a few questions," he says, warming a pair of tongs over the fire. And a bit of encouragement. Pete, historically speaking, torture wasn't used to punish. That would be too simple. It was used to get answers, or confessions, or just to pass the time, if the inquisitor was particularly bored. In your case, the charges are vague, possibly heresy, maybe theft, or maybe just having eyebrows that offended the local bishop. You're strapped into a device known simply as the rack. It's exactly what it sounds like. A long wooden frame, ropes tied to your wrists and ankles, and a crank that slowly pulls you in opposite directions, like medieval Pilates, but with less core strength and more dislocated shoulders. "Confess," the Examiner says pleasantly, as he begins to turn the wheel. You don't know what you're confessing to. It doesn't matter. The goal isn't truth, it's confession. That's why so many medieval records include wildly specific admissions like, "I danced with the devil under a walnut tree," or "I turned into a cat every Thursday." Because after 10 minutes on the rack, you'd confess to inventing fire if it made the pulling stop. Eventually, the Examiner tires of stretching you and decides to switch it up. Enter the thumb screws. You're unstrapped, more like unpeeled, and dragged to a small stool. Your hands are clamped into a simple iron device designed to crush your thumbs until your bones resemble a very disappointed bag of crisps. You scream. Everyone screams. Even the rat watching from the corner looks disturbed. It's important to note that medieval torture was legal, but not without rules. For instance, in some parts of Europe, you were allowed exactly 1 round of torture unless the court granted a second. Clever torturers got around this by making 1 round last as long as necessary. You know, a little stretching, a little thumb crushing, maybe a nice break for tea and branding. After what feels like an eternity and sounds like a bone xylophone, you're thrown back into your cell. Your body is broken. Your spirit is somewhere near the ceiling, quietly crying. You lie there in a heap of meat and regret, wondering if this was all a bad dream. Maybe you'll wake up and find yourself back in your old life. Warm bed, soft pillow, the luxury of not being flayed alive. But no, this is real. You're still here, still shackled, still marinating in your own personal compost heap. You'd think your fellow prisoners might be sympathetic. They're not. The guy in the next cell moans every time you breathe too loudly. The woman down the hall mutters spells or recipes. It's hard to tell. And the man across from you hasn't moved in days. You hope he's sleeping. You really hope he's not smiling. Eventually, your thoughts begin to turn dark. How long can a person survive on bread crusts and water that may or may not have teeth? When does the hallucination phase begin? You think you see a cat. It says hello. You don't question it. And through it all, the worst part remains the unknown. Will they come for you again tomorrow? Will they forget about you entirely? Will the wall eventually collapse and crush you under a pile of historically significant masonry? You close your eyes. Not to sleep. Sleep left you hours ago. But to hide from the flickering torchlight, the whispers, and your own thoughts. And just as you begin to drift into a shallow, pain-soaked daze, the key scrapes the lock again. This time, the footsteps are different. Lighter. slower, which is somehow even more terrifying. Your door creaks open, but instead of the usual mountain of muscle and mildew known as the jailer, in walks someone new. A man draped in a dark wool robe, cinched with a rope belt. His face is clean, unnervingly clean, and he holds a book, a real one, with pages. That's how you know you're in trouble. This is Brother Aelred, the Confessor, or, as prisoners come to know him, the final interview before either salvation or summary execution. Sometimes both in the same hour. He doesn't speak at first, just looks at you like you're something between a soul in need and a seasonal rodent infestation. Eventually, he says, "The Lord is merciful, if you are." You're not sure what that means, but given your last conversation ended with bone-crushing and involuntary weeping, you nod enthusiastically. Now, here's the thing about medieval theology in a dungeon. It's not here to comfort you. It's here to organize your suffering. Everything bad that's happened to you? Divine punishment. And everything that's about to happen? Divine justice, with a side of bureaucratic flair. Brother Aelred begins to read from his book. Not scripture, mind you, but legal codes mixed with church doctrine, written in Latin, which he's very proud of. You understand none of it, but you assume it boils down to, you're doomed, but with enough groveling, you might be doomed more politely. He asks if you're ready to confess your sins. You pause. You've already confessed too. Dancing with Satan's goat, which you invented. Sneezing on a relic, not even sneezing, really, more of a cough. And owning 3 apples, when the tithe only allowed for 2. But Brother Aelred isn't interested in the usual. No, he wants details. What were you thinking when you thought about thinking heretical thoughts? Were you harboring doubts about the church? About God? About your local bishop's oddly extensive wine collection? You attempt to answer, but your lips don't work quite right. Your jaw is swollen. Your voice comes out sounding like a broken bagpipe. Still, you manage to string together a few vague admissions, not because you believe them, but because the last time you hesitated, someone heated up a branding iron and pointed at your kneecaps. Aelred seems satisfied, or at least no longer fascinated. He closes his book, crosses himself, and offers a final piece of advice. Pray often. God hears you, even down here. You consider replying, but you're distracted by the smell. Aelred has stepped aside and left the door open just long enough for you to get a fresh blast of the corridor's perfume. A blend of blood, rust, and spoiled barley. It's almost nostalgic. Once he's gone, the silence wraps around you again like a damp woolen blanket, heavy, itchy, and mildly accusatory. You try to sleep. Again. It's harder now. The pain is duller, but constant. Your joints ache, your stomach howls, and you've started seeing things. Not in the poetic sense. Literally. A small figure in the corner keeps waving at you. You're pretty sure it's a hallucination. Or the world's friendliest spider. Let's talk about health for a moment. Specifically, the lack thereof. Your wounds are untreated. Infections were part of the dungeon starter pack. And antiseptic? Never heard of it. The closest thing to medicine you'll get is a moldy bandage ripped off another prisoner, and the jailer saying, "That looks not great." Gangrene was the real MVP of dungeon deaths, creeping through wounds like it paid rent. One day you've got a scrape. 3 days later you've got a festering limb that smells like regret and looks like someone tried to cook it in despair. Oh, and hygiene? That's adorable. There's no soap, no clean water. You've urinated on yourself more times than you care to count, and the straw beneath you squelches when you shift. Bathing isn't even on the schedule. You're not filth-covered. You are filth, now with a light seasoning of sweat and fungus. And then, mercifully, something shifts. Not in your spine, although that too, but in the atmosphere. The corridor goes quiet. No footsteps, no groaning, no chanting from down the hall. Just silence. Which, in a medieval dungeon, is the equivalent of ominous thunder. After what feels like an hour, the door creaks open again. This time, it's the jailer. No smile, no sarcastic remark, just a grunt and a key. "You're wanted," he says, which you're beginning to think is code for "prepare your last words." You're pulled up, slowly, since your legs are currently in open rebellion, and dragged down the corridor. Again. But this time, you're taken not to the torture chamber, not to the Hall of Rats, but up stairs. Real ones. Each step is agony. A personal insult to every nerve in your lower body. But you're not about to complain. Because the higher you go, the more you begin to notice something amazing. Light. Real, natural daylight. You'd forgotten it existed. The warmth of it. The way it doesn't flicker from torch smoke or carry the scent of rat droppings. Your eyes burn as they adjust. Your nose twitches as it relearns the smell of grass and wood smoke and fresh dung, which, hilariously, is a huge improvement. You're taken into a stone room above ground. There's a window, a small one, but it shows sky, blue, endless sky. A man in robes sits at a desk, a scroll in front of him. He doesn't look up, just waves a hand. "This is the one?" he asks. The jailer grunts. You consider trying to speak, but your tongue feels like it's grown moss. The man nods. Sentence to be carried out tomorrow. That's it. No explanation, no appeal, just a casual reference to your impending demise as if discussing lunch. You're hauled away, but not down. Not yet. You're tossed into a different room. Smaller, drier, somehow colder than your cell. This, you realize, is the holding cell. The pre-execution chamber. A place for you to contemplate, regret, and, ideally, sob loudly enough to satisfy the guards. You sit there, alone, with your thoughts, with the cold, and with a very clear understanding that tomorrow will be your last. Unless, of course, something unexpected happens. But that's for next time. You sleep, sort of. You dream, definitely. And all the dreams smell like wet wool and cabbage. In the pre-execution chamber, time slows to a drip. Not even a trickle. Just a cold, damp drip, leaking from the ceiling onto your face every 11 minutes. You count them. It's the only thing you have left. The straw is cleaner here. Not clean, just cleaner, meaning it's only mildly blood-stained. And the rats seem less aggressive. Maybe they sense you're not long for this world and are respectfully keeping their distance until it's buffet time. You've stopped asking why this is happening. That was a luxury for your first week below ground. Now you just wonder which part of your body they'll target for dramatic effect. It'll be public, of course. That's the medieval way. Executions weren't hush-hush affairs. They were community events. People brought their kids, their lunch, sometimes a fiddle. You close your eyes. The hallucinations are back. One of them is dressed like a jester and keeps muttering about pardons and potatoes. You hope he's real. At dawn, or what you assume is dawn, based on the slightly less oppressive darkness, the jailer returns. He brings food, real food. This is historically accurate and deeply unsettling. Before an execution, prisoners were sometimes given a better meal. bread that doesn't shatter teeth, soup with actual vegetables, water that doesn't squirm. You know, merciful stuff, just hours before you're permanently removed from the census. It's the medieval equivalent of a farewell lunch, if lunch also came with a side of beheading. You eye the bread suspiciously. You chew slowly. Each bite feels like it might be your last, which, to be fair, it probably is. Then comes the priest. Not Brother Elred this time. This one is older, kinder, and has a beard so long it could be used as a scarf. He sits beside you, takes your hand, and tells you to make peace with your soul. You ask, "What if I already did that last night?" He pats your shoulder and says, "Then do it again." He offers you last rites. You nod. Whether or not you believe in divine forgiveness, you're certainly not turning down extra credit at this point. Then the final walk begins. 2 guards escort you through stone corridors, past mossy walls and carved archways, up toward the courtyard where your fate awaits. Your legs protest, your back groans, your knees emit a sound normally reserved for collapsing furniture. And then, light. Full, glorious daylight. You blink like a man reborn into an allergic reaction. The sun hits your skin, and your eyes water immediately. You forgot how color worked. Everything's so vibrant. Even the chickens pecking in the dirt look majestic. Now, depending on what you were sentenced for, your method of execution might vary. Hanging? That's popular, but reserved for common criminals. Beheading? A bit more stylish, the aristocratic favorite. Burning? That's for heretics and witches. So many witches. A suspicious number of witches, frankly. But what's this? No gallows, no executioner in a leather mask, no woodpile stacked ominously near a stake. Just a small crowd, a podium, and a man holding a parchment. You're confused. So is the rat you've named Clarence, who is poking his head out of your shirt pocket like a tiny, furry lawyer. He's not real, probably. The man with the parchment clears his throat. "By order of the Lord of the Manor," he says, "you are hereby released." You blink. Surely that word doesn't mean what it used to. "Released?" you croak. "Indeed," he says. "On condition." Ah, there it is. The condition, as it turns out, is service. Not freedom, not a warm bath, and certainly not a pension. You are now officially a ward of the castle. A human paperweight. A body to be put somewhere inconvenient and tasked with something beneath the attention of the staff. Basically, you've been promoted from dungeon prisoner to human broom. Your job, cleaning out the latrine trench. Yes, the one directly below the garderobes. Those charming castle toilets that drop straight into a channel running outside the wall. You are now the person who manages that situation. In a historical twist, this job was very real and absolutely necessary. Waste management, even in the 13th century, wasn't just about dignity. It was about not dying from the plague before your afternoon bread. Latrine keepers were essential, also frequently ill, frequently ignored, and almost always ankle-deep in consequences. You're handed a wooden scoop and a rough wool apron. That's it. No boots, no gloves, no hope. The trench is long, steaming, and deeply emotional. You get to work. Your fellow castle workers pass by without eye contact. One tosses you a crust of bread. Another says, "Could be worse." You believe him. Because yes, you are no longer in chains. You are not on the rack. You are not hallucinating from a rat-infested pit. You are shoveling feces. You pause, wipe your brow with a sleeve that is now no longer a sleeve, and glance up at the sun. It's beautiful, warm, blinding, and completely wasted on a man knee-deep in waste. But you're alive. Sort of. And that, in this world, is its own kind of miracle. Of course, there's one more problem. Something stirring in the castle. Something worse than dungeons, rats, and trench duty. Rumors, whispers, that a prisoner recently released may not have been entirely innocent. That someone in the tower wants them back. And guess who just got a summons? The summons arrives at sunset, not with a trumpet or a royal seal. No, with a grunt and a kick to your hay pile. You sit up slowly, regretting every joint that still functions. Your tunic is stiff with history. Your knees sound like a crumbling cathedral. And your soul, bless it, has quietly detached and gone somewhere sunnier. The same guard who once dragged you by your ankles through the torture corridor now glares at you like you personally insulted his favorite pig. Which, to be fair, may have happened during the hallucination phase. He gestures toward the keep. Upstairs, he says. Lord wants a word. Now, this is new. Lords don't usually speak to trench scrapers. Lords don't see trench scrapers. The only time you interact with nobility is when their bodily functions travel past you at speed via the garderobe. So this feels significant. And not in the let's promote him to butler way. You're marched up the stone steps, past the kitchens, past the great hall, up to a small chamber that smells of incense and judgment. Inside, a long table, a scribe, 2 guards, and a man in embroidered robes who looks like he was born frowning and never recovered. Lord Osric, of Who Gives Ashur. He doesn't ask you to sit. Of course not. Your knees wouldn't allow it anyway. He clears his throat and, without looking up from his parchment, says, "There's been a clerical error." Your stomach drops like a trebuchet payload. You don't speak. You've learned. Speaking in front of nobles is a sport you're not qualified for. You simply nod slowly, trying not to make eye contact or facial expressions or sounds that could be interpreted as rebellion. Seems, the Lord continues, that your charges may not have been entirely accurate. A pause. You try to remember your fake confession. The dancing goat? The apples? The theological sneezing incident? Which part? You whisper. The Lord waves a hand. The part where you weren't actually guilty of anything. Ah, that part. He sighs deeply. The sigh of a man who's been inconvenienced by the survival of someone he assumed was already a skeleton in the basement. Unfortunately, he says, you've already been processed. That's a fun new word for tortured, nearly executed, and assigned to a trench of eternal consequence. So, he continues, you'll be transferred. Sinan, now, in most medieval contexts, transfer could mean anything from moved to another posting to dumped into a river with a rock tied to your legs. Turns out, in this case, it means sent to the monastery. You blink. A monastery? As in monks, cloisters, bread? Yes. You're being turned over to the local abbey, where your new job will be helping copy manuscripts. Apparently, your suffering has made you quiet and obedient, both high-ranking monastic virtues. They assume your silence means piety. You assume it means you've forgotten how to make sounds beyond weeping and wheezing. A few days later, you're on a cart, bumping down a dirt road toward your new home. A small stone monastery surrounded by sheep, bees, and men who've voluntarily taken vows of silence and celibacy. You're not entirely sure which is more terrifying, but here's the thing. It's peaceful. No one kicks you. No one brands you. No one demands that you name your demon accomplice, while tightening screws around your knuckles. Instead, you're given a bowl of stew, a cot with an actual blanket, and a pile of parchment. You're asked to write. You don't know how. They teach you. And for the first time in what feels like 12 lifetimes, you feel warm. Not just physically, existentially. The rats are gone. The air doesn't reek of spiritual death. The food doesn't fight back. You're still stiff, still sore, and still profoundly traumatized. But now you're traumatized in Latin. A year passes. You copy sermons, psalms, herbal recipes you can't read but admire for their illustrations of oddly muscular turnips. Your hands ache from ink and repetition. Your eyes blur from candlelight and marginal doodles of dragons biting bishops. And one morning, while grinding a fresh stick of charcoal, a novice asks you where you came from. You pause and say only, "Below." Because how do you explain it? The dungeon, the darkness, the endless cold, the hallucinated jester, the near execution, the trench of doom. You don't. You just breathe deeply, savor the smell of beeswax and bread, and go back to writing the letter P, which, incidentally, is the perfect letter to start your favorite new word, peace. The second history is why you wouldn't last a day as a medieval dungeon jailer. Imagine waking up to the sound of screaming and realizing it's not even your turn to be tortured. Welcome to life as a medieval jailer. You blink your crusty eyes open, scratch something you hope is just a flea bite, and remember, oh, right, it's Tuesday. That means at least one tooth pulling and 3 confessions. Just another cheerful day under stone and iron. The year is 1371. The 100 Years' War is still rumbling on somewhere over in France. But you? You're battling rats the size of toddlers and the smell of feet that have never known a bath. Your workplace? The town's dungeon, a charming windowless basement of the old keep, where sunlight fears to tread and oxygen goes to die. Now, before you start imagining iron bars and polite keys like in a Robin Hood movie, let's get something clear. This dungeon is mostly holes. Holes in walls. Holes in floors. A hole in the ceiling that leaks cold water directly onto the luckless prisoner of Cell 3. You've started calling it the drip of despair. And speaking of despair, your bed is a repurposed grain sack stuffed with something that may have once been straw. Or possibly hair. You've stopped asking. Your blanket is a piece of wool so coarse it could be used to sand furniture. If you had furniture, you don't. You have a stool that wobbles and a chamber pot that doesn't. You stretch. Everything pops, including your jaw, which dislocated slightly last week when you tried to yawn too enthusiastically. Breakfast? A bowl of barley mush with what might be onion in it. Might also be rat. You eat it anyway because, in medieval times, flavor is optional. Chewing is optional too, depending on how many teeth you have left. Now, down to the dungeon. You light a torch, or try to. The flint's wet again. Eventually, you get a sad little flame going, coughing on the first waft of smoke like a chain-smoking hedgehog. The dungeon smells, as usual, like damp stone, boiled cabbage, moldy wool, and that one prisoner who thinks washing is a plot by the church. You really should move him farther from the entrance. But moving anyone means touching them, and you've already burned through this week's courage. You walk past the first cell, empty, save for a few bones. You left those there to intimidate the new arrivals. Ironically, they're chicken bones. No one's noticed yet. Second cell, Wulfric the Unruly, arrested for hitting the priest with a goose. Yes, really. He's humming something that sounds suspiciously like a pagan chant. You nod politely and move on. You don't get paid enough for theology. Ah, cell 3. The leak. Its resident, a pickpocket named Alric, is curled up in the driest corner, which is not saying much. He greets you with the traditional dungeon good morning, which is a mix of a moan, a cough, and something that sounds like an insult, but might just be dysentery. Here's a fun historical curiosity. The average medieval dungeon didn't have individual cells. Prisoners were usually thrown together in one large room and left to sort it out, which they did, often violently. But lucky for you, your lord has installed wooden partitions, not to be kind, but because it's harder to question a corpse. You check the punishment roster pinned to the wall with a nail and a suspicious stain. 2 floggings before noon, 1 interrogation, and a man accused of witchcraft who needs to be kept comfortable. You're not sure what that means, but it probably involves tying someone upside down. You sigh. Another day, another dozen ethical violations. Let's talk about the flogging. The whip, lovingly nicknamed Old Bessie, is frayed but effective. You sharpen the tips with vinegar and crushed salt, which you learned from a retired torturer who now brews ale in the next village over. Small world. Your assistant, Godric, who got the job after setting fire to the mayor's privy, and seeming interested in justice, hands you the prisoner. It's a thief, or a debtor, or someone who looked at a guard funny. Honestly, it doesn't matter. You go through the motions, tie them up, read a half-remembered law about property or divine right, and give them a few lashes. Enough to sting, not enough to kill. You're saving that effort for the interrogation. That's your specialty. You even took a short seminar from the Inquisition, which is to say, you overheard some monks discussing pressure points while drinking too much mead. You've got all the tools, the rack, wobbly, the thumb screws, rusty, and your personal favorite, the questioning chair, which is just a stool with a nail hammered through the middle. It gets answers, mostly screams, but sometimes answers. Now take a deep breath. Not too deep, mind you. The air here can peel paint. Your next customer is accused of heresy. She says she's innocent. They all do. You warm up the branding iron anyway, because just in case is the official motto of the medieval justice system. By mid-afternoon, you've finished the paperwork. It's one scrap of parchment that says it was handled. You sign it with your thumbprint because literacy is for nobles, monks, and that one weird merchant's daughter who insists on reading. You head upstairs for your one perk, ale. Not the good stuff. Yours has floaters, but it's warm, mildly alcoholic, and distracts from the smell of your own boots. You drink it in the courtyard, watching the sun you haven't seen all day, and wondering if the fleas in your tunic dream of freedom. As night falls, you return to lock things up. Wulfric is still humming. Alric is still leaking. The witchcraft guy is whispering to the rats again. You make a note to keep an eye on him. The rats have been acting weird. You douse the torch. The dungeon sighs back into darkness. You climb the stairs to your chamber, crawl into your scratchy sack, and close your eyes. Somewhere below, someone screams. You smile. That means everything's normal. But tomorrow? Tomorrow, someone new arrives, and they're carrying a sealed letter from the bishop. That's never good. By the time the bishop's courier arrives, you've already confiscated 3 wooden spoons, 2 suspiciously sharp bones, and 1 surprisingly aggressive pigeon. Yes, someone tried to smuggle in a pigeon. For emotional support, apparently. You let it go. which immediately made you the most merciful person in the entire building. The bar, it turns out, is not high. The sealed letter sits in your palm like a dead mouse, small, ominous, and probably about to ruin your evening. It's waxed with the bishop's signet, a crooked shepherd's crook with Latin around it, which loosely translates to obey or else. You break the seal, unroll the parchment, and instantly regret learning how to read. The bishop is sending you a special prisoner, not a petty thief, not a goat botherer, not even a rumored witch. No, this one is a man of some learning, which is medieval code for dangerously literate. Worse still, he's a clerk. That means he can read, write, and, most offensively, argue. The bishop suspects him of heresy, sedition, and, worst of all, unauthorized scripture interpretation. In other words, he said something clever in front of the wrong monk. He arrives in a cart that smells faintly of parchment and fear. His name is Elias, and unlike your usual guests, he doesn't look terrified. He looks irritated, like being locked in your dungeon is an inconvenience, the kind that interrupts a good book. He adjusts his robes, squints at your face, and says, "This can't be sanitary." You consider having him flogged for that, but honestly, it's fair. You throw him into cell 4, previously inhabited by 2 brigands and a broken lute. He eyes the floor, notes the rat droppings, and mutters something about hygiene. You add grumbler to his list of offenses and close the door with extra clang. Now, what do you do with a heretic clerk? You could try the rack, but his wrists look delicate, and your rack is already booked for a suspected sorcerer with 3 wives. You could go the thumbscrew route, a classic, but it's hard to intimidate someone who corrects your Latin pronunciation mid-threat. You decide to try something new? Conversation. The next morning, you bring him a bowl of breakfast porridge, normally reserved for guards. He sniffs it, stirs it twice, and politely requests a lemon wedge. You stare at him. "Never mind," he sighs. "Do you have salt?" You do not. You have mold. And a spoon. As he eats, you lean against the bars and clear your throat like someone trying to sound official. The bishop says you've been spreading unlicensed interpretations. Elias raises an eyebrow. "Do you mean I suggested that maybe the Book of Job is not a literal instruction manual for life's misfortunes?" You blink slowly. "I said suffering might be part of life's mystery," he continues, chewing methodically. "Not necessarily a punishment." The friar fainted. It was quite the spectacle. You scribble this down, not because it's helpful, just because it looks professional. You add a few extra words to make it sound official. Suspect exhibits signs of free thought and uses long words during porridge. Here's a historical curiosity for you. In many medieval dungeons, torture wasn't just punishment. It was persuasion. Convince the prisoner to confess, and your job was done. Truth was optional. Confession was everything. If someone admitted they spoke with demons, that was a win. If they denied it under torture, that was also a win. You couldn't really lose unless the prisoner escaped, which happened, sometimes through the drain. You double-checked the drain that night. Still there, still disgusting. On day 2, you attempt the quiet treatment. You leave Elias alone in silence, assuming solitude will soften his mind. But he seems perfectly content. He organizes the straw into neat piles. He names the rats. One of them, he claims, is a philosopher. You grow concerned. On day 3, the bishop sends a follow-up letter. It asks for results. No clarification. Just a vague threat and a drawing of a very annoyed saint glaring at a devil. The message is clear. The heretic must confess. You sigh and fetch the questioning stool, the one with the nail. You find Elias meditating in his corner, possibly praying, possibly napping. It's hard to tell with scholars. You open the cell. He looks up. I assume this is the part where I scream until I see visions of angels? You pause. Possibly. He folds his hands and stands. Do I get to explain my theological argument first? Or is this more of a scream and stab kind of situation? And suddenly, you don't know what to do. Because here's the thing. Most of your prisoners are terrified. They shake. They sob. Some scream just from the sound of the door unlocking. But Elias, he's calm. He knows the game. And worse, he's judging your technique. So you try something new. You sit across from him, on the nail-free stool. What do you want? You ask, not entirely sure who's interrogating whom anymore. Elias smiles faintly. I want to go home. I want to finish copying a manuscript. I want to not die in a drafty hole, because the bishop can't tell the difference between curiosity and rebellion. You nod. Reasonable. Then he leans forward. And I want you to know something. You're not just a jailer. You're part of the story now. That night, as you write your usual end-of-day report, prisoners remain alive. Mostly, you stare at the flickering candlelight and hear his words again. Part of the story. You pour yourself a cup of the guard ale, which tastes slightly less like feet when warmed, and stare at the bars leading downstairs. Something is changing. And the next morning, when you open cell 4 to find Elias gone, not escaped, but missing, the door still locked from the outside, you know the real story has only just begun. When a prisoner vanishes from a locked dungeon cell without breaking the door, digging a tunnel, or transforming into a fog bank, you usually blame one of three things: witchcraft, divine intervention, or that guard who forgets everything and smells like turnips. Unfortunately, all three are suspiciously plausible. Elias is gone. Vanished. Evaporated like morning mist, if morning mist left behind precisely folded straw bedding and a very smug-looking rat. You stare into cell 4, the silence pressing in like damp wool, and you think, this is not ideal. Also, I'm probably going to die. Now let's pause a moment for a brief historical curiosity. Medieval jailers were not exactly high-ranking members of society. They were often chosen for their ability to look menacing, carry a key ring, and not ask too many questions. But they could still be hanged for negligence, especially if that negligence involved losing a potentially heretical scholar during an ongoing theological turf war. You do what any professional would do. You panic. Quietly, but with gusto. You double-check the locks, still intact. You sniff for alchemical residue, because once a prisoner claimed to turn into smoke, and all he'd really done was set his straw mattress on fire and run through the chaos. Nothing here. No scorch marks, no broken bars, no shattered reality. Just the soft, infuriating smell of incense. He left incense. You don't remember giving him incense. You back out of the cell and slam the door like that'll trap the absence inside. Godric, the assistant jailer, who's been asleep under a table since breakfast, finally notices your expression. "What's wrong?" he asks, picking a beetle out of his beard. You consider your options. You could tell him the truth, or you could make something up. Or, and this is your favorite, you could distract him with another rat hunt and quietly clean out your quarters for a discreet relocation to somewhere far away, like Constantinople. "New prisoner," you say. "Real slippery. might still be in the walls. Godric perks up immediately. He loves a chase. While he's enthusiastically poking around the storeroom with a ladle and yelling, "Come out, you philosophical worm!" you slip upstairs to think. The bishop will expect a report, preferably one that doesn't include the phrase, "he dematerialized like a well-read ghost." Instead, you try a different approach: investigation. Now, this is a bit of a stretch, because jailers aren't known for their sleuthing. Your usual methods involve hitting people until answers fall out. But Elias has changed things. He's introduced a dangerous new element to your life: thought. You begin with the cell. Aside from the aforementioned incense, mild, floral, annoyingly sophisticated, you find three things: a bundle of rat-chewed parchment tucked under the bedding, a charcoal drawing on the wall that appears to depict you wearing a crown, unnerving, and a scrap of cloth bearing a symbol, a quill inside a circle of thorns. You've seen that symbol before, on a wall, in the chapel. You are not a fan of symbols. Because in medieval towns, symbols usually mean secret societies, forbidden cults, or someone's cousin who thinks he's starting a movement. Either way, it rarely ends with a polite discussion and tea. You stare at the parchment. It's a fragment of something bigger, a copied line from a banned text. You can't read it all, but one phrase stands out in plain Latin. The light is not above, it is within. You roll it up and shove it deep into your tunic like it's cursed, which, given your luck, it might be. By evening, you've made a decision, a dangerous one. You're going to the chapel. Now let's be clear. Jailers don't go to the chapel unless they're dragging someone for confession, punishment, or burial. But tonight, you find yourself standing in the cold, cracked sanctuary of St. Angram's Chapel, a building so old even the pigeons avoid it. Candles flicker. Shadows lean dramatically. Everything smells like old moss and guilt. You walk past the altar, toward a back wall you haven't looked at in years. There it is, the symbol, carved faintly into the stone. A quill. Thorns. Your skin prickles. And then, footsteps. You spin, hand on the dagger you keep purely for intimidation. It's more rust than blade. And find yourself face to face with someone unexpected. It's the priest. Only, it's not the usual priest. This man's robe is different. Thicker. Embroidered. His eyes are sharp and unsettlingly amused. "You've seen the clerk," he says. It's not a question. You nod, because lying to a man who looks like he reads souls for breakfast feels unwise. He spoke to you, then? Told you something? You shake your head. He steps closer. But you listened. There it is again, the accusation of curiosity. In medieval times, the deadliest sin next to ambition. He was never meant to reach the dungeon, the priest mutters, almost to himself. He was intercepted on the road, slipped through. You found him. Interesting. You open your mouth, close it, and settle on. He cleaned his cell. The priest narrows his eyes. Then he smiles. A thin, unsettling smile that makes you suddenly feel like a child who's just admitted to drawing on the cathedral walls. "You'll deliver a message," he says. You swallow. Tell the bishop the clerk was not a heretic. He was a mirror, and the church should stop looking. With that, the man turns and disappears behind a hanging tapestry like he's late for a secret meeting with doom. You stand in the chapel, stunned, with the air around you colder than it should be, and your thoughts spinning faster than your training ever prepared you for. Back in your quarters, you light a candle and stare at your blank report parchment. You pick up your quill. You write the truth. He was never here. And with that, you tuck away the parchment, blow out the candle, and sit in the dark, wondering when exactly you stopped being a jailer and started being something else entirely. The next morning begins, as all great medieval crises do, with a visit from someone holding a stick and a deeply suspicious expression. Enter Sir Alric of Gurnham, the bishop's personal enforcer, amateur theologian, and full-time grower of what might be the angriest mustache in the kingdom. He rides up to the dungeon with 3 horses, 5 soldiers, and enough righteous indignation to power a minor crusade. You hear him before you see him, barking at the stable boy, berating a pigeon, and loudly threatening to cleanse the town with fire and vinegar. You haven't even had your turnip mush yet. The door bursts open. Sir Alric storms in, armor clinking, eyes squinting at everything like he suspects the walls of harboring sedition. "Where," he growls, "is the heretic?" You smile, politely, and hold up the parchment. According to this, he was never here. Sir Alric blinks, once, slowly, like a man not used to being spoken to in complete sentences by people with soot on their faces. "Explain," he says, which in noble terms translates to choose your next words, like your life depends on it, because it does. You take a deep breath. He arrived. He was placed in cell 4. And then we discovered it was a clerical error. Oh, that's the beauty of medieval record-keeping. Everything is a clerical error if you squint hard enough. He was released? You nod. Sir Alric leans in, sniffing like a bloodhound who's caught a scent, but can't tell if it's heresy or just poor hygiene. And the bishop signed off? You produce the seal. It's fake, not too fake. You borrowed it from an old report and dabbed it with stale gravy. The illusion is less forged document and more official parchment that had a rough night. Alric stares. The room creaks. And then, blessedly, Godric returns. Godric is a miracle. Not because he's clever, quite the opposite, but because in this moment he chooses to march through the room triumphantly, holding a half-dead rat on a stick and yelling, "Found the heretic!" There's a pause. Alric turns. "Is that a rodent?" Godric nods. "Smells like incense." The room is now so full of confusion, it might qualify as a philosophical debate. Alric glares at you. You shrug. The rat blinks once, then expires. Somewhere, you're sure Elias is laughing. Alric storms out to report this madness to the bishop, presumably after interrogating the stable boy and threatening the moon. His soldiers trudge behind him, one of them asking Godric if he's selling the rat. You sit down. Breathe. Your hands are shaking. Because while you're still alive and technically employed, the web is tightening. And somewhere out there is a vanished clerk with a tendency to rewrite destinies. That night, you find something new, tucked under your sleeping mat. Another note, folded, sealed with the same quill and thorn sigil. You open it carefully. Inside, a single line. The cell was never the prison. You were. You stare at it for a long time. Then you walk down to the dungeon, alone, with only a candle and a growing sense that things have already changed. You stand outside cell 4, open the door, step in, and wait. At first, there's nothing, just the usual smells and the faint sound of dripping water. But slowly, you feel it, that eerie stillness, like the air itself is listening. A breeze moves across your cheek. Impossible. There are no windows. Then, behind the wall, a click. You turn, press against the stone. Something shifts. A panel swings open. A hidden passage. Of course there's a hidden passage. You grab your candle and peer in. Narrow steps spiral downward, carved into rock. Damp. Ancient. This isn't part of the original dungeon. No one built this. It was revealed. And suddenly, you understand. Elias didn't escape. He knew the way out. He was never locked in. He was mapping a way through. You hesitate, then take a step. And another. The passage curves. The air grows colder, but your mind is burning. Every step feels like shedding a layer of your old self. Jailer, servant, silent cog in the wheel. Below the jail, there's something deeper, older. The staircase ends at a door, wooden, iron-braced, carved with symbols. Not religious, not exactly. Symbols of thought, eyes, books, flames, a door of questions. You lift the latch. It opens soundlessly. Inside, a chamber lit by oil lamps, still burning. Someone has been here. Shelves line the walls, filled with scrolls and books. Not ecclesiastical texts. Forbidden ones. You see works in Arabic, Greek, Hebrew, maps of stars, drawings of anatomy, diagrams of machines that have yet to exist. This isn't a hideout. It's a library. And seated at the far end, reading by the light of a single lantern, is Elias. He looks up, smiles. Took you long enough. You stare. He gestures to the bench beside him. Tea? You sit. And that night, the jailer becomes the student. By the time you sip Elias's so-called tea, which tastes suspiciously like boiled moss with a hint of candle wax, you've crossed the line from dungeon warden to accidental conspirator in the most politely subversive underground society this side of the Papal States. Well done. All it took was a missing prisoner, a secret door, and the slow realization that no one in charge actually reads your reports. You sit in a room that shouldn't exist, lit by oil lamps, crammed with books that the bishop would gleefully burn, and filled with the hushed rustle of knowledge breathing in the dark. Elias, the supposed heretic, leans back on a stool, the sturdy kind, no nails involved, and smiles like a man who never intended to escape, only to be found properly. "What is this place?" you finally ask, scanning a wall of scrolls labeled in a language that looks like Latin after a night of heavy drinking. He shrugs. A reading room, a vault, a sanctuary. Depends who's asking. Since it's you, let's call it an idea that survived. You nod slowly, sipping the tea again, just to punish yourself. Elias explains, centuries ago, a circle of scribes, monks, and curious peasants started preserving texts, not just religious ones, but all knowledge, ancient medicine, astronomy, mechanics, ideas that didn't fit into sermons or sit neatly inside church-sanctioned parchment. They built secret places under libraries, behind chapels, under dungeons, because, ironically, the most forgotten places were also the safest. Dungeons, he says, are brilliant hiding spots. No one visits unless they have to. No one asks questions. And the people who work there? He looks at you. Well, they're rarely listened to. You raise an eyebrow. So what am I now? A librarian. Elias smirks. You were always more than a jailer. You just didn't know it. You glance around at the books. Most are worn, water-damaged, but still legible. You spot a treatise on crop rotation, a diagram of a water wheel, a book of Arabic poetry, and, bizarrely, a guide to dental hygiene that could have spared you a molar last winter. You feel the weight of it, centuries of wisdom, buried beneath iron bars and screams, all waiting. Why tell me, you ask? Why now? Elias grows quiet. Because there's a storm coming. The bishop's no fool, just afraid, and fear makes people dangerous. This place won't stay hidden forever, but it might survive if people like you help carry it forward. You blink. People like me? He nods. The invisible ones. The ones no one watches. Jailers, scribes, gravediggers. We're the margins. But that's where the real story hides. And then he gives you something. Not a weapon, not a bribe. A book. Small. Bound in faded leather. Blank pages. For your notes, he says. You take it like it's holy. That night, you return through the passage. Seal it. Clean cell 4 so thoroughly, Godric thinks you're possessed. You forge 3 new pages for the dungeon log, including a totally believable report about a rat uprising. Sir Alric returns 2 days later, fuming and flustered, demands to see the prisoner. You shrug, produce a log sheet with a stamp so smeared it looks deliberate. Godric backs you up with excessive confidence and 3 unrelated anecdotes. Alric storms off, convinced the real heretic is hiding in the forest. He leaves behind a crate of confiscated wine. You don't question it. Weeks pass. You still open the cells, feed the prisoners, swat the fleas, and write your reports. But at night, by candlelight, you copy. You transcribe. Quietly, faithfully, you begin to fill your little leather-bound book with words from below. Every drawing, every observation, every page that shouldn't exist, you bring it upstairs, and you teach Godric to read. Poorly, very poorly, but still. Winter arrives with its usual flair, freezing winds, screaming inmates, and Godric's annual attempt at growing a beard. You burn the last of the bishop's letters for warmth. No one notices. By spring, the rumors start. Whispers of other dungeons where prisoners vanish, but never escape. Places where guards are found with books in their pockets. Quiet rebellions that don't burn churches. They build libraries. You're not alone. Then, one night, you return to the hidden vault and find it empty. No Elias, no lamps, just a note. You've done well. Time to make your own cell door disappear. You sit alone in that silent chamber and realize something strange. You're not afraid. Because in a world full of swords and sermons, you've found something sharper. A thought, a question, a book, and it's still open. So you walk back up into the dungeon, unlock every door that matters, and wait for the next story to arrive in chains. Because now, you're not a jailer. You're the key. The third history is why you wouldn't last a day enduring medieval water torture. Imagine being tied to a splintered wooden plank and dunked into a freezing barrel of water because someone heard you mutter the word herbs. Welcome to justice in medieval Europe, where legal proceedings are replaced with near drownings and your fate is left to the judgment of water itself. Cold, indifferent, splashy judgment. He didn't even know what he was accused of. That was the most medieval thing about it. You wake up in straw that smells like wet animal and panic sweat, and a man in a leather hood points at you with a stick. That's how your day begins. Not with breakfast, not with a question. Just a stick and a vague implication that you've committed an unspeakable crime, the nature of which may or may not be invented on the spot. Stand. The Reeve wants words with you, said the hood. Words, of course, meant you'd be dragged across town by the arm like a goat with gambling debts, only to arrive at the market square where everyone's already watching, and the Reeve is half a mug of ale into his morning sermon. Now pause here. Breathe in the cold morning. Notice the slight smell of burnt onions and pig lard that hangs in the air, the lingering perfume of a village where hygiene is aspirational and everyone's secrets ferment along with their cabbage. He was a cooper, a barrel maker, which is ironic because in a few hours, a barrel would nearly kill him. His name was Anselm, late 30s, prematurely stooped, with a spine that curved like a poorly planed board. He was known for three things: fixing barrels, muttering to himself, and making a pungent onion salve that cured everything from chapped lips to questionable marriages. The last part? Apparently enough to get you waterboarded in front of your neighbors. "You are brought before this gathering," intoned the reeve, who looked like an angry carrot in a robe, "on suspicion of witchery and unnatural knowledge, namely, the possession of healing draughts, unblessed by holy hands." Anselm blinked. "I just rub onions in goat fat." There was a pause. Someone in the crowd coughed, possibly from an unrelated onion rash. "Such knowledge is not known to godly men," said the reeve, "and thus we test thee." Now, test is a strong word. What he meant was the ordeal by water, a beloved pastime of the legally confused and the spiritually suspicious. The rules were simple. If the accused sank, he was innocent. If he floated, he was guilty. Either way, something would be proven, and no one would take responsibility for the outcome, which, if you think about it, was very on brand for the 14th century. Historical curiosity pill. In some regions, water was believed to reject evil. So if you bobbed like an apple at a child's feast, congratulations. The water had officially declared you a sorcerer. Science. Back to the square. You're standing barefoot in mud. You haven't eaten in 18 hours. Your hands are tied with a rope that smells vaguely of fish and last week's prisoner. And in front of you, a barrel the size of a coffin, filled with icy water freshly hauled from the stream. The crowd leans in, because nothing makes the cabbage taste better than a side of village justice. Anselm, to his credit, remained unusually calm, possibly because he assumed someone, anyone, would intervene. A priest? A neighbor? The drunk guy who always claimed to be his cousin? But this is medieval Europe. There are no lawyers. There are only wet feet and bad omens. As they lifted him onto the plank, arms bound, shirt already soaked from the morning dew, he glanced up at the crowd. Old Mrs. Winthrop crossed herself. One child threw a turnip. The reeve raised a hand. "Let the test begin." They tilted the plank. The first thing he felt wasn't the cold. It was the absence of air, the momentary panic of not knowing which way was up. The second thing was the cold. Imagine every pore in your body suddenly screaming, "This is how we die." That's the sensation. Not just cold. Weaponized cold. He flailed, or tried to. The rope at his wrists held tight, dragging his arms back. His legs kicked, but barely moved. The water was too dense, and his tunic floated up around him like a soggy flag of surrender. Now, here's the fun part. Medieval water barrels weren't exactly sanitary. This wasn't fresh alpine spring water. This was reused baptismal water, rainwater runoff, and possibly soup residue from the last village feast. If the cold didn't get you, the mystery organisms probably would. They held him down for a count of 10, though who knows if anyone actually counted. Time works differently when your lungs are full of peasant broth. When they pulled him out, he gasped like a fish dropped on a cart, sputtering, eyes wide, hair plastered to his face like seaweed. "He floats!" someone cried. The reeve nodded grimly. "Then let it be known. The water has judged. The man is guilty." Which is a bit like saying, "The sky turned gray, therefore you stole a chicken." But sure, logic is optional when your legal system involves drowning people to find out if they're witches. The crowd began to murmur. Some jeered. Others shuffled their feet awkwardly. One woman whispered, "But he fixed my butter churn last month." None of it mattered. The reeve had spoken. The water had spoken. Anselm had floated. And what came next was worse than the dunking. But that we'll save for tomorrow. The worst thing about being declared guilty by a barrel of water? It's not over. It's never over. The dunking is just foreplay. The real punishment comes after. Wet, shivering, and sentenced to something called mild interrogation. A phrase that, in medieval times, had about as much credibility as honest tax collector or tasty turnip. Anselm wasn't even dry yet. He sat on a stool made of something that may once have aspired to be a tree. His tunic clung to him like a cold eel. Mud ran in a little stream from his sleeves. His left sandal had disappeared somewhere between the barrel and humiliation. And around him, 4 guards with the combined literacy of a single ox. They brought him to a room. Well, they called it a room. You and I might call it a damp hole where nightmares go to ferment. Dirt walls. 1 candle. A bucket in the corner that was either for water or for screaming into. Possibly both. "Name your accomplices," barked a man who could have passed for a turnip wearing armor. Anselm squinted. "Accomplices in what? Rubbed onions on a rash. I didn't cast a plague." The guard nodded solemnly. "Ah, refusal to confess. Classic sorcerer move." Now let's take a moment here and appreciate the medieval legal system. In this radiant age of advanced jurisprudence, guilt was determined not by evidence, but by whether your head floated and how twitchy your neighbors were. Accusation was proof. Denial was further proof. Confession was absolute proof, and asking what you were being accused of was considered a clever trick and therefore also witchcraft. Historical curiosity pill. In some jurisdictions, the ordeal of water wasn't just for witches. It was used for thieves, liars, adulterers, heretics, and anyone whose nose looked too pointy on a Tuesday. The idea wasn't to learn the truth, it was to produce a truth that fit the narrative, preferably one the reeve could read out loud at the tavern. Back to Anselm. They tied his wrists to a wooden chair. You know, for comfort. Then they brought out a jug of water and a cloth. Oh no, not again. This was different from the dunking. More intimate. They called it softening the tongue, as if waterboarding someone was just a gentle warm-up for a chat. Here's how it worked. 1. Lay the accused back. 2. Drape the soaked cloth over his mouth and nose. 3. Pour water slowly onto the cloth. 4. Wait for the body to panic. 5. Repeat. The result? The sensation of drowning without the courtesy of an actual body of water. Medieval innovation at its finest. The cloth slapped over his face. He jerked, but the ropes held fast. Water flowed. Cool, steady, terrifyingly polite. The mind knows it's fake drowning. The body does not. Every cell screams, "You're dying." It's not pain, exactly. It's panic. Like being buried under every bad decision you've ever made, all at once, and none of them involved investing in a dry tunic. They stopped. For now. "Still won't talk?" said the interrogator. A man with 1 eyebrow and 2 chins, both of which looked deeply disappointed. Anselm coughed up half the Holy Roman Empire. "I can't talk if you're filling me like a soup pot." "You see his insolence?" one guard muttered. "Yes," nodded the other. "He drowns sarcastically." They repeated the process. water, cloth, suffocation, gasp, repeat. At some point, Anselm lost track of time. The candle flickered. The room swam. His ribs heaved like bellows. His mind tried to remember if goats could be witnesses. His only comfort was the absurdity. The kind of absurdity that makes you want to laugh, but if you laugh, you inhale linen. After the fourth pour, he broke. "Fine," he choked. "Fine, I'll confess. To something." The guards leaned in. "Say the names," said one chin. "What names?" "Your co-conspirators, other practitioners of herbcraft and unnatural salves." Anselm blinked water out of his eyelashes. "You mean like my aunt?" They nodded, solemn and satisfied. "Good. Very good. Continue." The duck in the mill pond. He saw everything." Scribbling. Very official. "Duck. In. Mill pond. And the pig at St. Mary's Trough. It talks to me. In Latin." More nods. No one questioned it. In fact, this was perhaps the most convincing testimony they'd heard all month. You see, in the world of medieval justice, there was no bad evidence, only inconvenient innocence. As long as a confession could be extracted, a verdict could be declared. The outcome wasn't the point. The ritual was. You weren't being punished for what you did. You were being punished for existing in a way that made someone else uncomfortable. And Anselm? Well, he existed very uncomfortably now. He was dragged, soaked and sputtering, back into the public square. His confession was read aloud, right after the listing of fines for stolen turnips, and an announcement about lost sheep. "Let it be known," said the reeve, "that Anselm the barrelman hath confessed to consorting with fowl, swine, and other impure agents in the practice of herbcraft and unnatural cures." There were murmurs. One boy whispered, "I knew pigs could talk." Anselm swayed. Someone threw a wet cabbage at his leg. A mercy, really. He was hungry. The reeve raised his hand for silence. "For this, he shall serve 3 days in the stocks and be ritually cleansed." Which sounds nice, until you realize the ritual cleansing involved more water. He was too tired to argue. As they hoisted him into the stocks, wet wood, splinters, ankle-pinching brilliance, Anselm had just enough energy left to mutter, "I should have been a baker." The crowd laughed. Not kindly, but with the kind of laugh that says, "Thank you for being the victim today, so I don't have to." But the worst part? The cleansing. Because tomorrow, at sunrise, the village priest had a bucket, a brush, and the enthusiasm of a man who truly believed scrubbing someone's soul involved a lot of elbow grease. And Anselm, well, he wasn't done drowning yet. At sunrise, the priest arrived with the ceremonial bucket like it was the Holy Grail. Except instead of divine wisdom, it held lukewarm water and a smell that could only be described as fermented sheep disappointment. In his other hand, he carried a brush, the kind usually reserved for scouring pots or angry root vegetables. Today, however, it would be used on Anselm's back. Ritual cleansing, they called it. A spiritual rebirth via scrubbing, because nothing says redemption like exfoliation under duress. Now, you might expect this to take place inside a chapel, bathed in candlelight, choir humming softly in the background. That would be nice. That would be a merciful mistake. Instead, it took place in the square. Again, public penance, public stocks, public bucket. It was part of the show. Because in medieval Europe, repentance wasn't real unless at least 7 people were watching and someone's pig tried to eat your ankle mid-sermon. "Let this man's sins be washed," the priest declared, dipping the brush into the suspicious slurry. "And let the Lord rinse his soul as I rinse whatever this is." He began scrubbing, enthusiastically. Now, keep in mind, Anselm had spent the previous day submerged in plague broth, interrogated until his lungs filed a complaint, and locked overnight in damp wooden stocks that pinched the skin like a disapproving ant. He had no food, no dry clothes, and no dignity left to soak up the mess. His skin was raw, his spirit soggy. And here came Father Wilhelm with a bristle brush and the upper body strength of a righteous tax collector. "Blessed are the pure in heart," the priest chanted, "and soon also in armpits." Anselm winced. "Is this really necessary?" The brush paused. "Only if you value your soul." "I'd rather value my spine." Scrub. This wasn't a cleansing. This was sandpaper baptism, the kind of spiritual renewal that leaves actual splinters. For the record, the water wasn't warm. It wasn't cold either. It was that terrible medieval temperature. Tepid. The same temperature as disappointment. It smelled like mildew, ash, and possibly regret. A little like the holy font, if the font had been stored in a barn with identity issues. Now, here's something you might not know. In some parts of medieval Europe, ritual cleansing was believed to prevent demonic possession, especially if the accused had spoken in tongues, which, loosely translated, meant talked to animals, read a book, or argued with a priest. Anselm had done none of these things, but he did once suggest that nettles cured boils, which was enough to earn a full baptism by brushstroke. Historical curiosity pill. Many ritual punishments in the Middle Ages blurred the line between health, superstition, and public entertainment. It was part hygiene theater, part religious fan fiction, and always designed to make sure no one ever felt too confident around superbs again. By the time the priest finished washing his back, Anselm looked like someone had tried to zest him like a lemon. His arms were too sore to move, his wrists ached from the stocks, and he was still damp, spiritually and otherwise. The crowd had dispersed. It was a weekday, after all, and someone's goat had escaped again. Only a few lingering children stayed to point and whisper. One of them offered a crust of bread that may or may not have been previously chewed. Anselm took it gratefully. He had 3 days in the stocks. That was the sentence. Technically survivable. Uncomfortable? Yes. Undignified? Absolutely. But survivable. Unless, of course, it rained. Which it did. At noon, clouds gathered like nosy neighbors. The wind picked up. And then, in true medieval fashion, the heavens opened with all the subtlety of a vengeful soup pot. Rain. Cold. Sideways. Unapologetic. So there he was. Soaked again. Chin on damp wood. Knees aching. Water dripping from his nose into the mud. And in the background? The priest, under a canvas canopy, sipping something hot and reading a psalm aloud in what could only be described as passive-aggressive mercy. Somewhere nearby, a goose honked with what Anselm swore was malicious glee. A man passed by and spat. Another simply nodded and said, "That's the barrel man, isn't it? Talk to pigs. Dangerous, that." Anselm sighed. The pig didn't talk back, he muttered. But logic had long since drowned. Night came again. The rain slowed, replaced by mist. Steam rose from the mud like a ghost, trying to file a noise complaint. Anselm dozed in spurts, that half-sleep only available to prisoners, sailors, and parents of medieval toddlers. Every creak of wood echoed. Every gust of wind felt like a challenge. And in the dark, more water. Because someone, and he suspected it was the baker's boy, decided it would be funny to tip another bucket over him. He blinked awake, sputtering. "Witch can't burn if he's always wet," said the boy, laughing. Anselm coughed. can't sleep either. That night, he didn't dream. Just floated somewhere between memory and misery, tethered to a wooden frame and a small, ridiculous hope that this would all be over soon. But there was still one more surprise, because come morning, on the final day of his sentence, the Reeve arrived with a scroll. And nothing ever boded well when scrolls were involved. He cleared his throat, eyes gleaming with bureaucratic purpose. "Due to the severity of your confessed crimes," he began, "the council has agreed to enact a final measure of purification." Anselm groaned. "Please, no more water." The Reeve smiled. "Of course not." He stepped aside. Behind him stood two men, holding a barrel. Another barrel. Anselm stared. "Is it the same one?" The Reeve nodded. "We thought it poetic." It was, because if he was going to be drowned in metaphor, it might as well be literal. The final day had arrived, and this time the barrel wasn't just for floating. It was for what came next. There's a special kind of dread reserved for the moment someone wheels out the same barrel you were nearly drowned in 2 days prior. Still damp, still slightly mossy, and now inexplicably decorated with a few wilted sprigs of rosemary, like a garnish on a particularly traumatic soup. Anselm blinked at it. "You're not putting me back in there." The Reeve smiled with the self-satisfaction of a man who writes his own job title in calligraphy. "Oh, no, not in it." He turned, raised a hand for drama. "You shall be sealed inside it." Yes, sealed. Because apparently, medieval justice hadn't quite milked the metaphor enough. After floating in it, confessing near it, and being symbolically rinsed because of it, Anselm would now become part of the barrel, like some sort of soggy relic for future villagers to find and misinterpret. Historical curiosity pill. In rare and extremely theatrical punishments, heretics or suspicious healers could be confined in wooden barrels, not permanently, but long enough to make a point. Sometimes they were rolled through the village, sometimes left in the square, sometimes filled with other unpleasant things, like manure, feathers, or, yes, cold water. This was not a legal system. This was improv theater with splinters. Two men approached the stocks. Anselm, stiff and sore, and significantly lacking in choices, was untied, dragged, and escorted, which here means manhandled like an unruly sack of wet flour, toward the barrel. It had a crudely hinged lid and a hole at the top for breathing. They claimed. Inside was wet. Obviously, bits of hay floated in what he hoped was water. The stench? Familiar. Like being hugged by every bad day you've ever had, soaked in root cellar runoff and left to steep. He was pushed in feet first. It wasn't a snug fit, more like a reluctant stuffing. "Watch your head," said one guard, as if this were a spa treatment. The lid slammed shut. Darkness. Then, the unmistakable sound of latches. He was in. Now, let's paint this scene properly. You are crouched in a barrel. Your knees are up against your ribs. You cannot move, lie down, or scratch the constellation of flea bites now decorating your left ankle. You are sitting in a half-inch of mystery water. You can hear muffled voices, occasional chuckles, and a chicken that is absolutely standing too close for comfort. There is a hole near your face, which allows just enough air in to ensure you don't pass out before the embarrassment really marinates. And then, the procession begins. Oh, yes, because this wasn't just punishment. This was performance. The barrel, with Anselm rattling inside like a confused legume, was hoisted upright, set on a cart, and wheeled through the village like a grotesque parade float. At every stop, Someone read aloud a list of his crimes, usually with added flair. Behold the man who brewed ungodly salves, cursed onions, witnessed speaking to poultry, possessed knowledge of nettles. Someone threw a turnip. Inside the barrel, Anselm exhaled slowly. At this point, he was too tired to argue, too sore to protest, and too soaked to care. He was a man reduced to moist pulp and public ridicule, clunking softly against the staves as the cart rolled over every bump and pothole the village had to offer. Around midday, the cart stopped. A familiar voice, the priest's, echoed outside. For the sake of his soul, he declared, we anoint him now in the ancient tradition of symbolic rebirth. What did that mean? It meant someone tipped another bucket of water through the hole. Cue gasping, coughing, splashing, swearing, muted. Spiritually wholesome swearing. Now, while all this was highly theatrical and deeply stupid, it was not technically intended to kill him. The goal was humiliation, a community cleanse, an object lesson for anyone else considering cabbage poultices or unsanctioned healing advice. And it worked. Because for the next 3 hours, Anselm became a mobile warning label. He was parked outside the market, near the bread stall, so villagers could buy their stale loaves, while staring at the soggy man in the barrel and thinking, better not mention my sore tooth to that herbal widow after all. Around dusk, they wheeled him back to the square. The crowd had thinned. Even humiliation has a curfew. The lid was opened. Light poured in, soft and golden, filtering through smoke and midges. A face appeared. The baker's boy again. You smell like pickled despair, he said cheerfully. Anselm croaked, thank you. He was helped out. Sort of. More poured, really. Like soup with knees. He collapsed onto the ground. Someone handed him a rag, possibly out of pity, possibly to stop the stench from seeping into the cobbles. The Reeve stood nearby, already drafting the official proclamation of community purity and justice served. The priest gave a satisfied nod. You have been tried, cleansed, and paraded. Your soul is no longer in jeopardy. Anselm coughed up something that might have been a beetle. You are free to go, the Reeve added. Go where? His home was a workshop full of damp barrels and unfinished repairs. His neighbors now crossed themselves when he passed. And he was fairly sure that Goose was still glaring at him. He stood, slowly, shakily, but upright. And for the first time all day, he smiled. Because he was still alive. Because he could smell roasted onions from a nearby stall. Because the water hadn't claimed him. Not entirely. And because somewhere, somehow, he was now a legend. The man who survived the barrel. And yet, as he limped toward his hut, damp and steaming slightly in the fading light, one thought haunted him. The ordeal might be over. But tomorrow, he'd need to make more barrels, and someone else might end up inside one. By the next morning, Anselm was back at work, which is what you did in medieval Europe unless you were dead. And even then, someone might still expect your ghost to finish tilling the field. He shuffled into his workshop, which smelled reassuringly of old wood and sawdust, and not at all like humiliation in a bucket. A rare upgrade. His tools were still there, mercifully unpilfered, lined up on the bench like old friends who hadn't heard what happened and were too polite to ask. He lit the hearth, stretched his back, winced. There were new aches in places he didn't know had muscle, and he was pretty sure his left ear had mildewed. Still, he was free, legally cleansed. Spiritually, well, the jury was out. But at least no one had tried to baptize him with a bucket yet this morning. which was what counted for progress. And then came the knock. Not the polite kind. Not the "we have bread to trade" kind. The slow, deliberate, legally ominous kind. The knock of someone holding either a scroll or a grudge. Outside stood the Reeve. Again. Of course. This time with a different expression. Less smug, more sheepish. Like a man who knows he's about to say something deeply stupid and has just enough conscience to feel bad about it. "Anselm," he began, "I bring news." "You always do." The Reeve hesitated. The council met. "Didn't you just try and drown me for onion ointment?" "Technically," he said, glancing down at his scroll, "it was for unorthodox application of root-based salves with insufficient ecclesiastical oversight." Anselm raised a hand. "Please, just say it." "They want to commission barrels." A pause. "For water torture," the Reeve added. "Official ones, for other criminals." Another pause, this time with more blinking. Anselm stared at him. "You want me, the man who was just inside a barrel, to make the next ones?" The Reeve smiled nervously. "You know the dimensions. Now let's take a moment, a brief contemplative moment, to appreciate the medieval job market in which full-blown persecution was apparently an excellent resume builder." Anselm was stunned, not because of the request. Oh no, this was a village that once tried to exorcise a baker's oven because it made unholy popping noises, but because of the sheer gall of it. He had questions, many of them, philosophical ones, ethical ones that included the phrase, "Are you all mad?" But in true medieval fashion, he asked the most important one first. "Are you paying?" The Reeve brightened. "Absolutely. A full groat per barrel. 2 if it holds witches. Plus a salt ration for every correct confession." Ah yes, salt, the universal bribe of 1371. Anselm sighed, deeply, philosophically. He looked at his bench, his tools, his half-carved staves and cracked hoops. He looked at the splinter in his thumb, still wedged there from the day before. And then he laughed. Not loudly, not bitterly, just a soft, hoarse sound. The kind of laugh you let out when life stops pretending to be fair and starts offering discounts. "All right," he said, "but I'm branding them." "Branding?" "With my mark, so people know who made the barrel they're tortured in." The Reeve looked unsure, which is how most bureaucrats looked when art entered a conversation. "Well, that seems fine?" Anselm nodded. "Excellent." He got to work, and so began his second reputation. Not as Anselm the barrelman who was drowned and scrubbed and paraded for crimes he didn't understand, but Anselm the Cooper of Confession. The man who made the barrels no one wanted to sit in, but everyone whispered about. Historical curiosity pill. Tradesmen in medieval towns were often compelled to make tools for punishments. Shackles, gallows, even iron shoes, especially if they were the only ones with the skill. You could go from town favorite to court supplier in one judicial misunderstanding. Over the next weeks, the orders came steadily. 1 for a suspected arsonist, 2 for excessive gossip, 1 for witchcraft via bad cheese. The barrels rolled out of his workshop, each with a neat stamp. ATB, Anselm the Barrelman. An ironic little signature of defiance. He started leaving pamphlets inside them, just notes, dry advice. Breathe slowly, mouth closed. Don't mention nettles. If you float, act surprised. It became a secret tradition. The barrel notes. Some said they were magic. Others said they were curses. One Reeve declared them mildly seditious. But no one stopped them. One day, a young girl delivered an order. She looked about 15, wore a blacksmith's apron, and didn't blink much. "Counsel wants another," she said. "Man accused of speaking too fondly about cats." "Ah," said Anselm, "the usual." She hesitated. "Is it true you were the first?" He smiled. "First what?" "The first to survive it. The water." He paused. "Maybe." She glanced at the barrel he was shaping. "What was it like?" He didn't answer immediately. He ran his hands over the curve of the wood. Thought of cold, of cloth and breathlessness, of turnips, of the hole in the lid and the chicken who watched him through it. "It was wet," he said at last, "and ridiculous." She nodded. "Seems about right." And then she left. When the barrel was done, he slipped a note inside. "Remember, the water only judges when someone tells it to." That night, Anselm sat by his fire, dry, unimprisoned, alive. The rain fell gently outside, and for the first time in days, it didn't feel like a threat. He poured a cup of small beer, stared into the flames, and wondered, with the smallest smile, if he might someday make a barrel for something other than punishment, like cider or pickles. But until then, business was booming. And somewhere in the distance, a new accused man heard a knock at the door and began his own journey toward a very damp, very circular fate. Sleep well, dear listener. At least tonight, your bed isn't shaped like a barrel.